So today we're going to be talking about magic users, and this has come to us via a request, which is something that we like to do every now and then, take on the feedback of everyone that's around. So what we're going to look at are a couple of things, starting with the um, players side of it, making up the character and getting that all sorted, and then moving on to something for the DMs and how to manage it and what you can do when you have that magic user that's cast that first spell and fired off. This is a huge topic and something that is probably worth quite a while in looking at, but it's something that I thought, well, what we'll do is we'll just deal with the first part and specifically starting up a character and getting it all going, and then talk about how we can get the magic user in and about and around and doing what they're doing at the same time. All right, so with that, let's get started and we can work it all out from there. So the first thing we want to look at is the intelligence, which is going to be the prerequisite for the character. When you're rolling up your stats, the highest value is either going to be chosen, if you do it that way, for intelligence, or in terms of if it's done in order, maybe the intelligence is one of the highest on that list and you're thinking it's a good opportunity to explore the magic user or choose magic user as a multi-class. We'll cover a little bit of that in both a little bit later. Now looking at the intelligence, you can see that it's actually made up of a number of different skills all composite together to create intelligence as an overall. And with a magic user, they're looking at being good at a number of different things or capable of different skills that are all based on all this. The most important one, and we'll come back to it every now and then, is perspicacious. Perspicacious is a form of problem solving and analytical thought, which is what we'll need to be looking at when we want to try and get the magic user into activity for the rest of the game. So looking at the next part, and what we see here is the number of spell levels that you're able to cast, like what spell level you're able to cast based on your actual intelligence. So the higher the intelligence, the more chance you have, or the higher level of the spell that you can cast. You need to be 18 intelligence in order to be able to go up to 9th level casting. That's pretty high and requires, you're obviously further down in the level chain, but for the most part, being limited to a certain level of spell has its drawbacks. But even if you're choosing to be a magic user of with 12, 13 or 14, then you still got some decent range and a nice array of of spells that you can cast. Something that's to keep in mind is that the average person has a 9 to 12 level ranking of stats, and from this is where we make up our normal big bubble that we have for our bell curve. Once you get to 14 and up, then you're in that top 10%, or definitely in the top 10, within the top 10% for 15, you're like 11 or 12% at 14. So that's something to keep in mind, that once you get to a certain point, you are that high up in the bell curve. And what you need to do is, as a player, is sometimes remember that even if you're running with 14s and 15s, you are actually running with some decent levels of skill and ability that's beyond everyone else. So what we're looking at here is the ability of magic users of knowing spells along the way. Something that's really important to keep in mind is that there is the Holy Trinity, or the Trinity, or the rule of 3, where Monster Manual came out first, then the Player's Handbook, and then the DM's Guide. The order in which we take information is in that order. Something that's in the Monster's Manual might have a rule or have a way that it's played. If it's not covered again in the player's handbook or the DM's guide, then you run it how it is, and so on. The player's handbook supersedes anything that's in the monster manual, and then you've got the DM's guide, which goes over the top of the player's handbook. A lot of what is written in here was so that the players could jump in and start playing. And some of the way that it's written and the way that it's ruling, if you were only going by this, you are actually ending up with a very limited magic user. And with lots of spells that are all run between the letters A and F. But for the most part, what we're looking at here is the key takeaway, the chance to know the spell, which is required for new spells when you find them. When you find a new spell and off a scroll or so on, that's the percentage chance of knowing that spell or being able to learn that spell correctly. Minimum number of spells, look, that's a player's handbook scenario, and for the most part, kind of necessary to be ignored. The maximum number of spells, never to be ignored. This is what we're talking about. So per level, you have that many spells, which even means that at that 15, 16 intelligence, you've got 11 spells per level. And while that sounds a lot, in some instances it's limiting in others. You'll find more spells that you'll be, okay, how do I manage my slots? And what can I do to manage the resource of knowing the number of spells that I have? And obviously, when you've got 19 intelligence, then you're all guns are blazing, which is very, very few, but there are facilities for that to happen. We'll explain that when we get to the races in a minute. But for everyone else, 18 is usually the maximum, and which gives us a maximum of 18 spells per level to be known. So here we have the notes, which basically cover us for what we were talking about before, and it all covers with exactly how the player's handbook would have you know everything, but everything from the DM's guide changes a lot of this, and so now we move to a new structure, which is likely to be a little bit better and more, not so much smooth, but at least easy to understand. I always like this picture because this sort of shows the difference between the magic user that gets it and the one that kind of doesn't. But that's just the way the game's played. So speaking of the races, this is where we have the list of who can and cannot be a magic user, and as you can see, when it comes to being a magic user, you've only got the options for elf, half elf, and human. So on that, when we have a look at what levels they can become, it's entirely dependent upon their intelligence, and we have to be mindful of how much intelligence the characters have. Now, what we were talking about before in terms of going up to 19, there is a single race within the elves that does allow for the +1 to intelligence over dexterity, and these are the grey elves, generally sort of looking more like the more higher elves that you have in Lord of the Rings. But with the grey elves, they live longer, and there's only a handful. You're talking about percentages, very much a lower percent. It's up to the DM if they allow for that, but if they do wish to allow for it, that's their choice. You remove the +1 off the dex, going to the +1 on intelligence instead. So looking at the stats, you can see how pretty much, it's just all 8, just the same sort of barriers as everything else. I know it's a small bone of contention for most people, or for some people, and things like the 16 for strengths for female elves, which obviously then limit the fighter side. But as an example, you're looking at, to be a Navy SEAL, you need to have about a minimum of 14 strength based on what they have. So if you're that female halfling thief, you can qualify for the Navy SEALs. And just because we need to prove exactly how weak magic users are in combat, and this is first edition AD&D, pre-1985, you're looking at dagger, dart, and staff for being their weapon proficiencies, which means that they're hardly ever going to be in combat. And again, what we need to do is constantly be thinking about how we can get those magic user characters to be more involved with either the way the parties are laid out or whatever happens outside of the combat arena. All right, so here we go with more of an actual explanation of our magic user class. So with the magic user, obviously we need a high intelligence, or as high as possible, because as we've discussed, we need that for the understanding spells as well as the maximum level spell known. Gary can't keep telling us how weak they are in combat, but they have mighty spells, mighty spells, which is great, except that, as he also explains, they are starting off at a rather low level and very weak, which again is one of those instances where we need to really look at how the magic user can help with the rest of the classes during the rest of the adventure. Once they've passed off their spells, once they've done their spell and they've done their thing and everything else, they need to find a way, and that includes working with the DM, and the DM needs to have an understanding of what they think is required as well. And we'll cover a little bit later in terms of how to use some of that, but ultimately the DM needs to have decided beforehand how magic users and how characters and how classes work beforehand. And what I mean by that is that when you're a character, you have a lot more influence in the world than a non-player character, which is why they're called NPCs. A magic user has a D4 hit points. A standard, normal, everyday, average human has about 2 or 3 hit points themselves. So they start off not much different to a standard, normal human, but very quickly move up once they've gone up a few levels. They've got to go up a few levels, but then so does their power, and they get to be increased. Now, from their ages, they also start a little bit later than the other classes, usually a couple of years on top of everything else. And that means that the amount of prep work that it goes into learning these skills requires a lot of understanding, the reading, the researching, and the knowledge behind it all. Once they get to the serious levels, then they're pretty groovy. But to begin with, they have a lot they need to work on. And with that D4 hit points per level, if you have for argument's sake, a human, you're looking at, by the time they're 11th level, you're looking at them having about 22, 24 hit points as an average, which isn't too bad, but they could be a lot better. Then everyone else will be on the 40s, 50s, 60s, and some fighters will even be 80 and 90 by a similar sort of comparison. The magic users do start with a very low level, and even if you multi-class, so even if you're a half elf and you multi-class, all of those hit points are cut in half, and hitting 11th level as a max plus the fighter level as a max, you're still running into that 20 to 30 hit points worth, the high 20s, maybe low 30s, but you're still running into that high 20s level of survivability. What I would suggest is that as a good option, you put intelligence up. They're number one. Obviously, that's got to be the first kick, but have maybe the second pip being on Constitution, because if you can gain any additional points anywhere along the way, that's going to help you. Plus 11 hit points across the term of the life of the character is really going to make everything seem amazing. At least then you'll be in your 30s rather than 30 hit points rather than hanging around the mid-20s. But with the lure of wanting to have a better armor class, you can always try and make an item, get an item, gain an item, find an item that helps you along with getting and improving your armor class. And magical items will maintain that for when you're casting your spells, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So what we're looking at here is that I just wanted to highlight that the Fighter magic user benefits from both armor, weaponry, and spells. This is from the multi-class section because we talked about multi-classes a little bit earlier. Especially when you're dealing with half elves and elves, there's going to be a big opportunity for them to want to take on a multi-class career, primarily because that's where they think some of the hit points were. Half elves need a whole section on themselves because they certainly have their own part way. They're a part-time everything, and so they struggle once you get to the higher ends. But that's a whole half elf thing. At the elf scenario, getting to 11th level if you're able to, or even up to 9th level, still gives you that top tier levels of spell casting. But having solid armor can really help you along the way, because obviously when you're casting spells, as we'll explain, there are limitations to that, and having a good armor class is key to survival. It's one of the most important parts of being able to survive in the game. And when you're a fighter magic user, then you have that option to still be able to use full armor and make maximum use of spells, even though if you were a magic user only, you wouldn't have access to any of those pieces of armor available. So as we can see from here, we have a massive amount of spells. This is just levels 1 through 5 when it comes to a complete list. But you can see how you have so many spells available from being a magic user. And a lot of these are Leomund's Tiny Hut or Bigby's whatever's hand and Melf's whatever and so on. Now we all know that these are all the original characters from the original playing days and so on. But what it does really highlight is the ability to make more spells. And I think it's more easier and much more accessible for magic users to make more spells, which we'll cover a bit later when we start talking about what they can do down the way. But you can see the lots and lots of first level spells, and what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a look at when you start and you have your handful of spells and you've got your initial amount of spells that you start with, then that's where it starts. So as we were saying before, back in what they were originally suggesting is that you would just go through the list from 1 to 30 and go pop. And what will end up happening is that if you're relatively unlucky, you'll get your 11 spells being A through F, and then that's it. Or you'll cherry pick and so on and so forth. So the DM's guide really makes that a little bit more interesting and useful. But having access or seeing all of these spells is really good, but I wholeheartedly recommend that once you start your actual adventure and once you start moving forward, the concept of beginning to make your own spell is really important, and putting your own spin on spells, because when you can't find a spell book or scroll that has magic missile or has a spell book that has fireball in it, you need to research those spells. And so understanding how that's done, and that doesn't detract from you knowing or not knowing the spell, researching, it just means the research failed. So, which is a lot easier and better to work with. And again, we'll explain all that as we move down. So what Gary makes mention of, and it's worth looking at, is just the scope of spells is huge. The magic user becomes so powerful towards the top end of their career. Even once they get to that elvish level of 9th, 10th and 11th level, you still have access to all those 5th level spells, which are just killers. Generally, it's the 3rd level spell, you can't wait to get that fireball or lightning bolt, and then once you get to 5th level, you're just really hitting with cones of cold and teleport as well, and so on. There's just so much to play with. And then Gary keeps on saying how powerful magic users are. The most important part of the entire process is that the spell levels aren't capped in terms of their effect. So if you're a 20th level magic user casting fireball, you are casting a 20d6 fireball. If you are an 18th level magic user casting magic missile, that's 9 magic missiles that's coming through. So yes, you do need to be higher up in terms of the XP, but then just remember that things like the Lish, as an example, who is a minimum of an 18th level magic user, they get all their spells. So that's a ton of spells, a massive, great big power range, which is the reason why they're a big bad guy and they're nasty. But you can just see how powerful they are, and by limiting the intelligence to the level of spell that you can learn, it means even if you come out sort of in that middle-ish sort of range, and as you gain age, your intelligence increases to its racial maximum, you might suddenly, I can now cast this spell. You're not going anywhere when you're 80 years old, and suddenly now you can cast Time Stop. But it's nice to be able to cast Time Stop when you need to. So, since spells are the main jam for the magic user, then we might as well have a look and see what the explanations are. We know what most of this is, but it's well worth just running over it, just so that way we have an idea of what it looks like, and then we'll break down one of the spells and see how it feels from there. So the spells have a range, which is in distance. So when it comes to the distance, you have the inch, which is the 10 feet within combat zone, 10 feet within town, 10 feet within confined spaces, or when time and uh, resources are important, then 1 inch becomes 10 feet. But generally, once you're outdoors and running around out in the fields, then you've got 1 inch being 10 yards or 30 feet. So the range is always done with inches, unless, of course, it's self, touch, or zero. So, I mean, when it's self, it means obviously it's the caster. Touch, they have to touch a person, an object, a thing, and if it's a target, then if it's an enemy, then they require a 2-hit roll. If it's an ally, they can just touch them. And then you got zero, which means that it just sits exactly based around where the magic user is located. Often something like a shield type spell might have as range zero. I'm just saying as an example, not shield, but something that's a bit more protective might be create like a force field bubble from where the magic user sits, and its range is zero, basing everything on itself, and then it'll have an area of effect. So the duration is how long it goes out there for, which is related to the number of rounds, turns, or instantaneous, or something along those lines. That's just how long it lasts. Area of effect, this is always done in tens of feet if it has an inch requirement, and it's always listed as something. So a 1 inch is 10 feet. It's always 10 feet when it comes to the area of effect. It's not never a 10-yard scenario. Even when you see things where they talk about 15-foot radius, they'll say it's 1.5 inches sometimes, or you know, well, it's 15 foot. Couldn't you have just put 15 and then foot? But they want to do what they do. Now remember, all of these inches are based off a 16 millimeter distance as well. So when you're a 16 mil, which was the Napoleonic frame, that is about 10 feet for a 1 inch space. So that's just where it comes from, if you are curious as to how that came about. Components. I like components. That's something that I like to play with. Obviously, a lot of DMs go, you just got stuff. Yeah, you can just do it. I don't like components and blah, blah, blah. But getting magic users to always find bits and pieces and scraps of monsters. I peel off this horn. I take away this bit of their brain. I have a vial of their ichor or anything like that. Like, all of those are really useful, and that's a very magic usery thing, because when they get to making their own spells, they might need to research those parts, or they might need those things. So components are really important in my mind, and that's something that I think that is worth keeping. I really like the way that they get used, and I think that part of the overall casting time, which we'll see in a second, takes up that whole I'm reaching for my bit and throwing my iron or my copper wire or whatever. But with the verbal component, you need to speak aloud and you need to speak up and out. With the somatics, you need to have space and you need to free movement, and you can't be laying down, or often even can't be sitting on a horse. You need to actually you can do it on a back of a carpet, like a flying carpet, because you're upstanding, but generally you need to have a bit of space. And then the material components, which is the bits and pieces that we're talking about. So with the casting time, that's usually done in segments, but it's not always. But it's oft useful in segments, which we'll talk about more in the combat aspect of the spell casting. But we'll sort of say that also you've got like rounds or turns, or the ceremonial spells can even be longer. And generally, when you look at it, especially from a clerical point of view, a cleric casting a spell is often a little bit longer than a magic user casting a spell, because a magic user is designed for a specific function, and that's I need the spell now, get it going, boom. So once we've got all of that, then we can move on to what the anatomy of a spell and what it looks like. So with this as a classic example, because this is one of the most common spells, is sleep, although I've just cut off the top. But you can see there where it's got the level of the spell, the range, and as you gain levels, it has a deeper, so like an extra range. Duration, 5 rounds per level. Components, verbal, somatic, material. Casting time is 1 segment, which means it goes off in the segment that it's cast. There's no saving throw. And the area of effect is special, so you have to read the description beneath. So that's just a general idea of how it sort of all works together. So if we break it down a little bit further, you've got there, you can see where we have the levels and so on. Some spells have a saving throw, and they'll tell you whether the effect is negated by a successful save, half effect, or none effect, or there's no saving throw. And sleep is one of these spells where everybody loves, because it's a cast once, affect many type scenario, and you're looking at about a 30-foot circle. Where it says 3 inches, it's 30 foot, and that's a diameter circle, and you can peel that out how you want, but everyone inside there is affected. And then it'll have a brief description, and as it says, see advanced monster manual for who it doesn't affect, and that's what I mean when in terms of the hierarchy. And then of course we've got the other bits, some extra information saying that you can be automatically slain whilst you're sleeping, because it's not just a sleep, it's a magical form of sleep which puts you into a deeper coma and makes you ultra vulnerable, as opposed to just regular sleep. Okay, so this is something that's well worth remembering, because it's only a handful of lines. This is exactly what is mentioned in the Player's Handbook on spells in combat, which unfortunately nothing much in here is relatively useful, but what we can peel out of it is that if the spellcaster is struck, grabbed, or magically attacked, therefore and failing to make the requisite saving throw, then the spell is spoiled and will fail. So what we're looking at are the nature of spell combat is that it's kind of difficult, or not really something that, as everywhere he goes, Gary talks about how it's not something that a smart magic user wants to do. But that's the fun stuff, Gary. We like to throw fireballs in combat and have my spellcaster cast a spell and have everyone rushing in to charge and then blow everybody up with a 15d6 fireball. That's the best way to go. But anyway, so what we've got is just explanation on that, how spells sort of work here. And this is the extent, as I said, the extent of what players get. Unless the combat is spell versus spell, many such attacks will happen at the end of the melee round. I mean, what he's referring to there is that essentially if you've got a segment 2 or more spell, then you start to move outside of the standard combat procedure, and the magic user is in a much more precarious scenario, because as they cast their spells, and if it's a lengthy cast time, that affects whereabouts the spell finally goes off. So for that, we need to turn to the DM's guide and get a little bit more into how this works. So now we've sort of concluded a lot of where the players sit, and everything to do with the magic user, the players and the DM needs to work together to be able to put all this character together. The player will want to try and squeeze as much edge and component out as possible, and the DM wants to try and be as friendly, knowing that it's a magic user, and there's a really good chance that they'll fall unconscious very quickly in the game. So what we do now is we sort of tone this out and move into the DM category, but it's all important, and everyone should have an understanding of where it sits. Okay, so this is the fun stuff right here, the acquisition of magic user spells. Here we are looking at the magic user with how they start out and what they need to do once they've started adventuring. The 99% of all their spells are going to be done after the creation of their spell, after the creation of their first character. So it's important to see what it is that they can do and whereabouts they can take these amazing characters and so on. So at first level, they get a number of spells as taught to them or provided to them by their master in some way. And there are generally two options. I prefer the second one, but this is the way that everyone sort of works and the way that they want to do it, and they're both perfectly fine. The first one is that you start off with Read Magic, then you start with the one spell from one of the offensive, defensive, and miscellaneous spell lists on their items. So with those, you can see that whilst they're not the entire full list of spells available from the DM's guide, like from the player's handbook, but they are a good number of spells. You can pick or you can roll. Honestly, it's a pick or roll, and the way that we're looking at it here is that you've got an option for doing either, but some people like to keep it fully random. Others like to do have a little bit more say. And yes, a player might choose sleep, but realistically, the magic user master who's training some new adept is going to give them the spell that makes this open up to be the one that they're after and the one that's most useful to them, because they know that the only way they're going to gain any further experience is by getting out and about, and they need to hang out with a bunch of people that will be able to keep them protected until the magic user can protect the rest of the party. So the second option, which is the one that I sort of work with, and the one that is preferred, I suppose, I hate to say that, but is one of the recommended options, is that they start off with 5 spells. And what I do is I like to think that Read Magic and Detect Magic are key, probably the two most important spells that a magic user is going to learn in their apprenticeship, because they need to be able to detect it and they need to be able to read it, and then pick one from each of the options from there. And whilst yes, everyone might pick Sleep, it's the defensive spell and the miscellaneous spell that is really interesting, and that's the one where a little bit more personality can come out, because not only are they less likely to be choosing that as their one spell per day, but at the very least, it's something that they get to work with, just to sort of play a little bit. Unseen Servant is really useful in the weirdest of locations, and once you get the ability to do an Unseen Servant, and let's face it, if Indiana Jones had Unseen Servant, getting that idol would have been a lot easier. So before we continue on, it's important just to highlight this. I wrote into TSR back a very, very long time ago, 1980, late 1979, early 1980, asking about all of this and having lots of clarification on this, where they talked to me about how they thought it was. And they sent back this great letter. And essentially what we're looking at is a really off-the-chart scenario, but what they also suggested at their end was that quite often that they provided D4+1 scrolls. It does mean that there's a 25% chance or so for the scroll to not actually work, but it does give the magic user a little bit more something to play with. Now, if you wanted to, you could do that just to give them a little bit more punch. Of course, we know that when you find a generic scroll is set at roughly 6th level, especially if you're going to have D4+1 of first level spells. So it's going to add a little bit of power, and the character will have to decide whether or not they want to use it or not, and so on. But and so on. But this is what was given to me as a suggestion, and what they did for some of their modules, which were a little bit more powerful, I suppose, or dangerous. it wasn't a bad idea to hand a couple of scrolls over to the character. Plus, it also gave the character an opportunity to learn some new spells. But anyway, so I just thought I'd throw that in there right about now because with it's very much more off the books, but yeah. And so now we come into some serious text war, which is what we know and love about the DM's guide. Lots and lots of text war. Naturally, the Magic User player will do their utmost to acquire books of spells and scrolls in order to blah 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 blah. As we know, they start with one, they get one. They have the initial spells that they own, and then that's it. After this, they need to explore and find, buy, or whatever. They can buy them off other Magic users, trade, or exchange something if they've got anything of value. They can find them on scrolls, and instead of using the scroll, they can learn from the scroll to write into their book. They can find enemy or NPC Magic user books and access those books and attempt to learn those spells. And they can research and make their own. So they're essentially the main ways of going forward with acquiring spells after they first start adventuring. The most likeliest way is generally when they go up against other Magic users, because quite often you want to keep the scrolls for themselves unless they've got a duplicate of the spell. Now this is where one of the most important spells that they never choose is needed, and this is the spell Write, which allows you to write a spell into your spell book that's of a higher level, and then that way when you get to that level to cast it, you can try and learn it. But you can only do that when you have the spell Write, which is important. So when you find or get a spell book, you need to cast Read Magic, which is what allows you to then crack open the enchantment to get into there. And then once you've done that, you can access that spell. Same thing when you open up a scroll, you generally need to have a Read Magic to do a Magic user scroll. So the hierarchy of scrolls, as we know, or as the more experienced players, give it to the fighter. Can they read it? Because if they can read it, it's a protection scroll. Nope. Give it to the cleric or druid. Can they read it? Nope. So it means it's not a clerical spell because they can read it straight off. Give it to the illusionist. Does the illusionist? Nope. Then they know it's not an illusionist script. Give it to the Magic user who can then cast Read Magic and within a hand has to use the spell or learn the spell a bit later. Thieves are getting the mix when they can start to read their own spell books, like Read Magic and so on, as when they get higher up in levels. But generally, with a scroll, once you've cracked it open and once you've done the Read Magic and once you've done all that, it starts to deteriorate. You are supposed to do a certain number of time frame before it becomes useless. The scrolls, that's something that the DM also needs to think about how they want to handle that from there. They can't just hold on to the scroll and then 3 weeks later reuse it. By that point, either the ink has fallen off, the magic has gone, or the paper has completely shredded itself. So generally, probably not so much the paper, but the magic on the ink has evaporated or died away. So there is a time frame to when they have to use the scroll in some way. That's worth remembering, because when the magic user makes their own scrolls at 7th level, then they need to remember these things. So anyway, but that's another conversation for a different day. We're trying to keep everything back to the first level scenario. So once they start adventuring and they can find their spells, they can learn new spells or write those spells into the books for future learning. When you do put them into your spell book, the initial spell book that they have is a 100-page bound tome full of vellum paper with a full-on tome book and looking gorgeous. And each spell takes up 1d3 pages per spell level. So at first level, if they've got 5, then that's 5d3 pages taken up. So also on top of everything else they have to worry about, they've got space requirements within their spells, in their spell books. There are other types of books where you've got the big magnum opus style book, which has 500, 600 pages. That might be bound and chained to a particular altar within their own layer. But then they'll have traveling books and other spell books that they can try and of lesser pages, so that they can just constantly make a hit list of spells that they take with them. So the spells that they select on a daily basis are really important, as well as the spells known, because to begin with, it's all pretty much the same. But after a while, especially once they get a couple of levels down, knowing what spells they're going to have on offer, then they have to pick, okay, I've got 2 first level spells, I've got a second level spell. What am I going to pick and choose? We're going to roughly do this, then I need to have this spell and that spell. And so on. So there's a little bit of resource management again for the magic user before they can continue any further. So the next and most important thing, I suppose, on top of all the other next most important things that they have, is this addresses all spell casters across the board, is spell recovery, which is really important, because as much as people would like to think that spellcasters are narcoleptic, they can't just sort of hang back for cast a spell, sleep 4 hours, cast another spell, long, so on. What we need to look at here is the rest time, which is essentially sleeping and absolute doing nothing, and so on. So at spell levels 1 and 2, which is what we're mostly looking at, you've got 4 hours. But then for every spell that you need to research again or pray for, or have the slots available for, then we're looking at 15 minutes per spell level. So you might cast 2 first level spells. The magic user can rest from early evening till midnight quite comfortably. Then they'll need at least half an hour of candlelight or lantern light or light to be able to go through the next 2 spells that they're going to have available to them, and then they can do their watch till morning, because it's their turn. And then they're up for that amount of time. There is that. But what we get to is, once they start to get to the higher level on spells, the length of time required for that resting becomes longer. So the likelihood that they're going to start flinging 5, 5th and 5th level spells around becomes less inside combat or inside a normal day, because they know that when they cast it, they need to have a solid 8 hours of rest, and they need to have it comfortable and be absolutely fresh, so that way they can learn 15 minutes per spell level their spells back. And if they've cast 3 or 4 first level spells, a couple of second level spells, a 3rd level spell and a 5th level, all of a sudden they're spending an hour or 2 hours in the morning, or when they wake up, just learning the next lot of spells again. That's when the other players are doing their other thing, and this is one of those times where it's like, okay, what's everyone else doing while the magic user and the cleric have to do their prayer and research for 2 hours before everyone starts in the morning? What are we going to do? And the fighters get to practice their fighting, the fighters get to train a little bit, and so on. So this is that added part for the rest of the players, when you say, oh, we work out some tactics between each other, and how to use each other's abilities, how to partner, like enemy swap and so on. So nothing ever stops, and that's one of the things that a DM and a player needs to have under control between both of them, is that nothing ever really stops. And that's what time is all about, right? It just keeps on going. So make most of what you've got, and as a player, tell the DM what you want to do. As a DM, work it out with the players as to what their standard operating procedures are, and working it out from there. Alright, so from here we get to the nuts and bolts of what it is that we're doing here. So the big explanation on how spells work is that by memorizing the formulae and trapping parts of your mind with the energy that comes from another dimension, whether it's the positive material plane, or the negative material plane, or wherever, that energy comes through. It might even come from themselves. It might come from the ether that's around. It might come from wherever. Depending on the spell type will depend on what it is that we're doing with how that formula works. And it sits inside the head, and it's a part of the brain, which is why you need to have that intelligence, and for clerics, the wisdom to be able to control that from, because it comes directly from the plane of their god and their deity. But with the magic user, it comes from a particular type of energy, and that comes into the brain, it locks it up, and then when they cast it, it shoots it out. So it doesn't physically affect. Sometimes there can be a side effect where it drains the person, but for the most part, most spells don't cause a form of exhaustion. They just sort of, they get used, boom, done, and then you have to spend that time to slot it back in. Most importantly, we're talking about, this is all called the Vancian magic, the Vancian style of magic from Jack Vance. And as Gary so eloquently puts it, if the players have any questions about this, then just direct them to your copy of the various Jack Vance novels, because he's just assuming that everyone already has them on hand, because, you know, why don't you? Personal disclaimer, when I was playing this back in the day, I did. So it was one of those things. We all did. It was one of those where we actually, a lot of us already were reading many of these novels or the short stories and collecting these books and things. So it didn't seem weird when he said that you had the slot in your head and you fired it off. That just seemed to be almost normal. But casting spells goes into the brain, you got the slots, and that's why we have the spell slots, and then they get expended from there. As you can imagine, from the player's handbook and then coming into the DM's guide, there was about like a year, 18 months between the two. There was a lot of play between Gary and various of his players and so on, and he had a lot of ideas afterward about how the spells should have worked, because obviously his players were seriously doing weird things with them and trying to get away with doing things, and so he was like, no, this is how it is and it must be like this. And so he created a special commentary. I'm not going to go through all of them, I'm not, so it saves you that. But if you've got a spell as the DM, you need to have a flick through and read through those, so that way you can see how the player's handbook spells have been altered when they are coming up to be used by the players themselves. All right, so here we're going to talk a little bit about some spell research, and this is that part of the gaining, the acquisition of spells as the player has progressed into the adventuring world. Now, the most important thing is that unlike the other parts of magical item fabrication, there is no level minimum for spell research. A first level character can research a spell if they have time and materials on their hand. If they have time and materials, they can make a spell. And that is the most important part of what the magic users do. And they just need to find those times. Now, whether that's, again, the DM will have an idea about how timing works. And in my mind, training is usually a good marker for that, where you've got 2 weeks where the characters aren't doing much while 1 or 2 characters are training and practicing to get to the next level. The magic user will be in the middle. So they'll have 2 weeks off here where they've got between the fighter learning how to do the next thing, the thief doing the next thing, and so on. And then you've got the time for when they do their own training to go up to level 2, what everyone else is doing during that period. But at this stage, you've got generally a couple of weeks when you've got the spell acquisitions and spell research being able to be done. So it's laid out very clear. This is one of the most clearest parts of the entire Dungeon Master's Guide, is on how to actually make scrolls, make spells, and make other magical items. But the most important thing is time and resources. So to successfully be able to research a spell, the character has to do a couple of things on their own, which includes researching what they need to do. They need access to a library, they need access to a lab, they need access to a lot of other parts of what they need in order to be able to make that spell. If they wanted to make a combination of a spell, this is when you can look at, well, they're building this and this, they're putting that together, And the example provided is that it could be two first level spells make a second level spell. A first and a sixth level spell might be a seventh level spell or whatever. So the DM gets to decide what level spell is being researched. But apart from that, the player works out what it is that they want to do. And they might have an idea from level one, I want to make a spell that does this. Well, you got to be X level before that can happen. And then they can spend their time researching, gaining materials, gaining bits and pieces to make all that easier, and especially gaining money. So that way, by the time they get to that part of the making of the spell, they can do it with some degree of ease, because it's more about how much money are you going to spend, how much money are you going to throw at the project than anything else. In fact, your level and the level of the spell is a bit of a, so like a plus and a minus. Your intelligence and how much money you're throwing down. They're the key factors for making a successful spell, reality. So researching a spell that already exists. Now this is when I get asked a lot of questions, because I don't use the book that shall not be named. That would be the, Anatakana. But about those spells, I treat them like spells to be researched, not so much spells that are automatically available. And I like to make spells up. I like the fact that a lot of my NPC magic users have unique spells. I will make up some spells for them, so that way they have something that's a little bit more unique, a little bit more personalized. If you're a spellcaster that wants to head down the pathway of electrical style output, you want to be a little bit more zappy with things, you may want to do side effects that include lots of electricity or electrical explosions and so on, which is fine. But you do that as part of your spell research. When you get Fireball off of Gleepwork the Eyebiter, that's his Fireball. That's the Fireball that he casts, that's what you're learning. But if you want something, we'll talk about personalization of spells a little bit later, but generally, when you're researching your own spell, you get to do your own thing. When you want to do Force Lightning, as an example, why is that any different than Burning Hands? But instead of fire, it's electricity. So then the DM and the player can come together to work out something in between, and you can go, this is what you need to do. Yeah, okay, this is the effect that's going to be. You look at what the description is on Burning Hands, you look at what you want to do, how similar, how much do they equate, and then what's different, and work it from there. And then it's like, it works out to still be a first level spell because it does the exact same thing, but with electricity instead of fire, and it doesn't set things on fire. It does this, blah, blah, blah. And you can do that. So that's the cool thing about researching spells, is that you get to do a lot more personalization. And I wholeheartedly recommend that when you got time and ability to do it, and that's what it's all about. It's about how much time and the materials to make it happen, but to do so. And I, as a DM, thoroughly encourage all of my players to get into some personalization of both the equipment as well as the magic side of the business. So here we have the most important part. So now we're talking about spells and combat. So what we're looking at is that we have a range of actions that can achieve during a combat round, and a combat is obviously set up as an initiative dice roll, a d6 from each side, and that tells everyone when they're going and so on. So when you're casting a spell that's over one segment, a one segment spell happens within that segment. So when you have a casting time of one segment, it's happening inside that segment. When you have a casting spell of two, it's happening plus one segment later, and plus two segments later for three casting times, and so on. So the casting time minus one is the modifier for the initiative as it goes off. When you get to go first or second, inverted commas, first or second, that's the opportunity for the enemy to choose to aim for the magic user. If they see that there's somebody at the back or somebody around swirling and casting, they may not get a chance to actually fire off the spell. They might get hit. They might have something happen which causes them to be lost. There's a lot in here about how Gary doesn't particularly think that spells in combat is a good idea, but we like spells in combat. We like casting fireballs, we like throwing magic missiles, and we like things that like sleep that just knock out a whole bunch of enemy. And it makes that magic user feel really cool for those few moments when they can shoot out X number of fireballs or magic missiles or cast or affected by sleep. So when you're looking at this, we're seeing that we've got the spells that essentially get done about the same time as missile weapons and magical devices and turning undead. So before closing to strike for ranging and charging. So closing to strike means within 10 feet or within your movement, and then charging is the double for the actual attack. So when it comes to spell casting during melee, before the round has gone, when we're declaring our actions, the spellcaster chooses the spell that's being cast. So they have it available, and then they say, this is what I'm going to cast during the round. Initiative is rolled, but then as the initiative markers go through, you have various things that affect it, so that when it gets to the part where either the spellcaster gets to go first, or the enemy have had their attacks at the spellcaster and so on, that's when the spells then go on. So it's important to know that when they're casting the spell, they have 0 dexterity effectively, or 0 modifiers to their dex. So even if they put a high value on their dex when they're casting spells, they lose it. This is what we were talking about before with the fighter magic users. At least they have chain, or they have something decent that allows them to just have a standing decent armor class, so that they can still cast spells in armor and have some sort of armor class, as opposed to the having an armor class of 10. But other items, magic rings, braces of defense, cloaks, all of those things, they affect all of that. So when you're casting a spell, you need to see where the target is for the most part. Like for most direct spells, you need to be able to pinpoint the center part of the explosion or the area effect or where it's going. So you need to see it. Sometimes someone can open a door and you can cast a spell and get it off and then close the door again afterwards. That requires a lot of trickery. Can be done. It's just one of those things. You've just got to be careful on how it all works. So the caster can't interrupt. They've got to keep going, or they lose the spell. So if they decide mid that, the enemies are destroyed, I'm going to stop casting my spell, you lose the spell. Which sometimes can be good, because when you're doing, like a fireball or power word kill, who knows? It might be worthwhile just sort of not setting it off on something that's either already dead or that's going to affect the rest of the party in some way. But the working motions of combat, the magic users will be targeted by intelligence characters, intelligent monsters, leader monsters. They might recognize, well, they should recognize that there's that guy at the back, or there's that guy in the middle that's waving their arms and doing something. And if they're able to control an attack that heads towards that person, it's something that that they will be wired to know, because magic is still around and everyone has magic. There are witch doctors, there are whatevers, and so they know what it takes. Because they protect their witch doctors, it's up to the party to protect their magic users while the magic users are doing their mojo and then firing it off. Ultimately, it is difficult in combat, but not impossible. And better off, if you can, magic devices, scrolls, they're all really nice. Because that's really where you want to sort of get a lot of the magic through. But even then, the magic scroll, so your scroll takes about the same amount of time to read it as it does to cast it. So that's a thing to remember. But also, when you've got your wand of fireballs, it's just a zip, zap, zap, boom, done. There might be a command word, but it fires off. And that's important because you get that instantaneous shot. Because if you get to identify the enemy magic user, you can snapshot with your wand of magic missiles and interrupt what they're doing much earlier. And generally, that's a good strategy as well, because as a magic user with, if you've got a good number of levels, you can sit like way back, you can get further back, you can start firing well past medium range on a bow and hit a magic missile and target the enemy because you unerringly strike whatever you can see, and boom, it gets done, and then that interrupts. But then they can do it to you as well. So that's the beauty of being a magic user. There's the strength and the weakness of all of that. So looking at the combat matrix, this is the melee of a magic user, and as you can say, it's pretty crap. So now the matrix is not the same as Thaco. It's sort of like Thaco, but it has a slight difference where you've got all those 20s, and that is so that someone like a magic user, even at first level, has an opportunity of hitting someone that's at -4, because they just need to roll it. They need a 20 plus to be able to hit. So if they come in from behind and if they charge, then that's +2 and +4. So now they need 16s and that sort of thing. Or if they're throwing a dart and they've managed to have a plus on the dart, or if you're in combat and you're a magic user, it's not going to plan. But essentially, there's nothing wrong, and we love it when the magic user is the last one standing and comes in with their lone staff hit requiring a 19 or 20, striking and managing to kill the big bad guy with that last, as everyone else has been thrown around and pushed around and done and dusted. He comes in and just boom and hits. That is one of the glorious moments that magic users talk about for their entire lives, when they strike that one hit and it's the hit that matters. But the matrix is a little bit different to a Thaco. We've gone through a lot of that, but it's worth looking at here in terms of that. You'll see that armor class 1 is a 20. So unlike a fighter where armor class 0 is the 20 and 1 is a 19, a first level magic user, their to hit armor class 10 is an 11. So they're 5% lower at first level than a fighter. And then of course they've got as their levels progress, it's not as, still not as good. No, not good, but you know, what can you say? But you see how uneven the progression is across. So even if you're looking at it from a Thaco point of view, it goes 19 and 16 and 13 and 11. It's not as even as you think. But still. In terms of the levels, so I mean, again, if you're in combat and you're a magic user, it's definitely not going according to plan. But I hear you say, when it comes to their saving throws, magic users should be pretty good, right? Well, they're okay. They've got their moments. Now, if we look at the magic users there from the columns across at 1st to 5th level, which is a healthy chunk. Now, in terms of the XP bottle, you're looking at the 5th to 8th level being quite a fast progression in terms of where they move by comparison to the other classes, because you've sort of, the XP bottle comes into the middle and then expands back out again. So whilst it's to begin with, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th levels are a little bit of a slog, then all of a sudden you've just got this ease in the middle, and then it sort of peaks back out to the final runs. But with the saving throws, we're looking at the 14, 13, 11, 15, and 12 at the lower levels. What you might be thinking to yourself is, okay, they're weak in physical constitution. So the 14 for paralyzation, poison, and death magic. This is a column that reflects well with also willpower type of saving throws. So when you have to do something that's a little bit different. So what I like to do is I use the saving throws as an option for quote unquote skill checks. When someone needs to do something that's based around a certain area, I think of what saving throw makes that. Then I apply modifiers based on whatever I need to make that happen. A classic example, as we can see on here, not that we're looking at them today, but the best for the thief is petrification and polymorph. So that's the reaction saving throw. Monks, when they need to deflect, uses that. So if you look at every class, most of them have a good value. And curiously enough, when it comes to the magic user, that good value isn't spells like you would think. It actually shrinks down and having a look at rod, staves, and wands. Rod, Staves, and Wands starts at an 11, which is their best, and one of the best scores out there. So there's a module where the high level magic users find, well, the party who have to be high level because of the type of adventure it is, find a collapsed spaceship, and there are items on there. What is used in that module, which was also a tournament module used, was Rod, Staves, and Wands as a way of trying to figure things out. Remember when we go back to Perspicacious and we look at that? Well, that's where we say, hey, man, this is where the perspicacious nature of the magic user comes from. So that's an 11 plus when it comes to Rod, Staves, and Wands. So that's a saving throw against. So obviously they understand the mechanical nature of the Rod, Staff, and Wand. They know when the person's going to use it, when the person's about to launch it, what it looks like, how they're about to use it, and that's the tone of how they get away from it. What I use the spells for as well, on top of obviously the saving throw, is like what the modern day world would call an arcana check. If they want to see what sort of magic has been used or is being used, or something mystical that they've been researching, they need to understand something about a character or a type of location, then that is what I would use in place for that. So naturally, there are ways of using the saving throws, but ideally they come as a last minute defense. When someone casts a fireball, you save versus spells. You get your defensive adjustment because you have to dodge, duck, and weave to try and get away from the blast. When you've got someone comes at you with a wand of magic missiles, that's an automatic hit, and a wand of something else, then you get a saving throw versus wands. There you go, you take it from that. So what we have now, I want to talk a little bit about personalization of spells and how I handle the way that spells are cast. So personalization is one thing. I mean, you cast Magic Missile. The Magic Missile is defined as X, as how it is. 6 inches plus 1 inch per level. You get one or more targets within a 10-foot square area. You have 1 segment casting time, blah, blah, blah. All of that's the same. And you get 1 for every second level that you go. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, ad infinitum. The damage on each missile is d4 plus 1, and there's no saving throw, and you get hit, you get blasted. So personalization could be a matter of how the magic missile is generated and what it looks like as it's being flung at the opponent. So it could be arrows, it could be darts, it could be shuriken, it could be just zaps and bolts of lightning. The way that spells are cast is defined in part by the person that's casting them, and also the spell, as we said before, the fireball from Gleepwerp the Eyebiter is going to be his fireball. So if you find his spell book, get his fireball, you fire it the way that he does it. But if you make up your own version of the fireball spell, which is exactly the same, but just your personalized version, it might have a slightly different feel. It might have an angry face at the front. It might do something else. But with something like Magic Missile, the one magic user might cast blasting darts, one might be what look like shards or steel or just energy bolts, as I said, or fields of lightning, bullets, like little bits of things, whatever. And that's something for the players and the DM a little bit to work out how you want it to look when it comes through. Because there should be enough space for customization so that the players can feel like that they've really started to shape the magic and weave the magic in the way that they want to weave it. And what I also see in this, when you cast the spell, yes, the spell does X, Y, Z. Can it be used for something else? Knock opens doors. But I know that from the tournament days, when you got points, if you use knock to break a chain that releases a cage, you got points for firing your magic missile at a bell to make it ping. You know, you got those sorts of things. So the way that the tournaments valued the spells was different, and I bring that in. I ran tournaments, the TSR level, so that was pretty pretty good. So again, it's one of those things where I feel that there's space for DMs to make their own way and how they want it to look. And especially when you're starting to do something like detect magic. When you detect magic well, but like how much do you detect? At first level, what do you detect? What are you detecting when you're a novice, when you've just passed the apprenticeship and you're out there versus when you're a 10th level? So if you detect magic on a ring of protection, the first thing you might obviously get is the enchantment because it's been enchanted. That's fine. Then, as you gain a few levels of experience and you cast detect magic on the ring, you might get enchantment and alteration and a hint of something else. But then you might get some abjuration as well. There might be a point where that overpowers it because that's the protective nature. That's the plus in the ring of protection. That's the plus. So as soon as you go, oh, this has got abjuration magic to it, which is beneficial and allows us to. So it's likely to be a ring of protection. You don't know until you put it on, but it's something that when you deeply drink the ether of magic, what you taste as you become more experienced becomes important. And so that's where I make use of that. And I do the same thing with other classes as well in the way that they run things. Because there's no real difference in the way that a first level detects magic to how a 12th level detects magic per the rules. So how you interpret that. And that's where it comes down from a DM to work out how you want your magic to actually flow. And this is something that I like to do, just to add a bit more color and a bit more flavor. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just something that's nice to make it in there, just to sort of give it that little bit of a tweak. So customizing the magic and how the magic is presented can be useful just to show you the difference between magic user A and magic user B. Because like the way that they use this spell, when they cast magic missile, see like 3 arrows shoot from their hands, bang, solid push. And someone else's 3 darts, 3 shuriken style flippy things or whatever. A blast of energy when you're doing all 4 of them into the one character. It might just be like one eldritch blast just sent it straight through. Make it useful and make it clear. So this is where, from a DM's point of view, personalizing something so that the magic user feels a little bit, ooh, this is cool. That's good. The rule of cool should work, and it doesn't have to just be, I kick down the door, I jump over the barrel, I flip on this, I throw that, and I chuck this. Man, that's cool. Rule of cool is also, that just sounds cool. This is just makes me look awesome when I do this at the right time. And it's good for magic users to get to that point, to be strong enough to stand on their own, but also build how they want the magic and the ether to flow through them as they gain their levels of experience. Well, I want to thank everybody for sticking around. There's so much more I wanted to actually talk about and to cover, but unfortunately I figured that this is probably long enough, and the most that anyone's ever going to watch of any of this is probably about 6 minutes. but I really want to appreciate everybody and thank everybody for supporting and for hanging around. There's a lot about magic users that are just so worth it, and the DM does need to work out ways of allowing the magic user to make use of their intellect, make use of their magical knowledge, make use of their monstrous knowledge for these things, how to best combat a scenario or work out a situation, let them have a crack at it. So there's room for the DM to make some space within everything that's available for the magic user to work out how something happens. But yes, so thank you very much. Sorry, I'm still preaching. Like I said, I could keep going. This is another one of those topics. I could just talk all day, but I won't. But I want to thank everyone. This is great, and I want to thank the people who are supporting the channel and all the subscribers, of course. That's always lovely. Please, any questions you want to put forward, if you want suggestions, shove them through. This was a particular suggestion, and I think it's a worthy topic of discussion, and lots of people did lots of different things and lots of different ways of doing it. There is no such thing as the wrong way as long as everyone's having fun and, in my mind, balanced, but that's also the eye of the beholder, trademark. But enjoy. I'm glad to be here and keep doing these things. So I also want to quick shout out to the Fortress in Melbourne, which is allowing me to do it in their premises today. That's the reason why it sounds a little bit different, just because I've actually got some equipment here. They're letting me use their podcast booths. But apart from that, that's not much else. Oh, and support Flipping and Turning. It's a magazine based on AD&D, old school. Lots of interesting articles written by different people, different perceptions, different ideas, perspectives, the whole lot. So Flipping and Turning is a great magazine. Get into it. It's been going now for about 5 years. It's went longer than Gygax, and it specifically deals with old school gaming, D&D, Gamma World, Paranoia, Boot Hill, all of those things. So it's old school. So if you like old school, you'll like Flipping and Turning. So check them out. Do a Google search. I've got some links around somewhere. Appreciate it all. Thank you very much. And we'll sign off now because I have to end it eventually. All right. Thank you very much.